Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, people who are here virtually, and good afternoon to those of the artists, policymakers, researchers, and practitioners in the audience here with us and in the virtual world out there. As she said, I'm Heidi Holder, the Frederick P. and Sandra P. Rose Chair of Education. I'm proud to chair this conversation with artists and institutions. And I think this is the panel that's sort of summing up everything, because we've talked about policy, we've talked about evidence, we've talked about the programs that are happening, but I wanted us to have a panel in which we talked about the site at which things occur. Where does this stuff happening? Who is it happening with? Who are the people? So we have about 35 minutes, but I wanted to get straight into the conversation. So I'm going to do some really brief introductions. So remotely, we have Mohamed Hafez, who is a Syrian-American artist and architect, who was born in Damascus, raised in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and educated in the Midwestern United States. Hafez's recent work responds to the atrocities of the Syrian war, and he creates miniatures. Mohamed depicts cities besieged by civil war to capture the magnitude of the devastation and to expose the frailty of human life. And this is also a devastation, to me, of art and culture as well. With us in Grace Rennie Rogers, we have Chaya Chom. And Chaya is the executive director of Mekong, the Vietnamese Cultural Center. In 2012, Chaya founded Mekong NYC in the Bronx, a social justice organization that empowers Southeast Asians through community organization and movement building, centering healing through arts and culture, and creating a strong safety net rooted in community power. And with us, we also have Anna Bess Moya Bell. She's the artistic director of Second Act. And Second Act is the coming together of two organizations, which is the Improbable Players and creating outreach about addiction support together. And they are merged under the joint mission of changing the way people and communities respond to the impact of substance use through theater and drama therapy. So I'm just going to go right into it. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to start with Mohamed. If you can talk a bit about, if you can tell us briefly about the role that art plays in healing in your personal practice.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me on this panel. I hope the day is going great. It sounds like a fantastic symposium. I can speak to my personal experience with art and healing because, you know, um, it started with me not being able to go home Syria before the war for about 10 years. So I was very nostalgic and very homesick. And, we're all busy with our day-to-day jobs. So I also had a very fast-paced corporate job designing very tall buildings with an architectural firm. So in order for me to perform and keep a straight face at work, I have maintained a studio practice on the side at my home, detailing and building these miniatures of Damascus and the country how I used to remember it. And it just so happened by dumb luck that, um, as the history shows, the country went through a very prosperous years in 2003 till 2010. And then as the war started, my art reflected that turmoil. As the destruction started, my art in that phase reflected that destruction, and then the aftermath of it, of my parents leaving and the refugee crisis, and my sister becoming a refugee in Sweden, and what that meant for us as a family. So by dumb luck, it's just if you look at my work parallel to history, each phase in each political phase in our region had its own impact on the work, and it was the only way for me to kind of lose track of time and cope with all the trauma that we were going under. I'll just add, typically the focus is on, and rightfully so, is on the loss of lives and so on. But as an architect, as an artist, seeing thousand-year-old minarets and buildings being bombed out of existence in my beloved country, for me there was culturally something to weep over and something to model in high detail and to teach and educate beyond just the therapy part of me, but also to take it to the next generation and say, you come from deep roots, and this is your country before all of this war happened.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. You referred to something that I wanted to pick up the thread with Chaya, because although a lot we talk about the role that art and healing has on individual well-being often, and that translates to family, however you define that, well as community. But many times we're talking about entire generations of people, and and I wanted to Chaya to talk a bit about the role that art plays in community healing and cultural preservation, as we are referring to Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees who were resettled in the Bronx. I don't know if many people know that. If you can maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah,
And
sure.
what that's doing there.
So, thank you. I mean, the symposium today was tremendous, and I'm so glad to be talking at the very end because of all the gems that were left and the amazing performances. And I think, for me, I came in 1985. I was born after the genocide in the war in Southeast Asia. We were resettled in the Bronx. And folks may know, it's home to the largest Southeast Asian population in New York City. And so for me, growing up in the Bronx and continuously, moving from one destabilized place to another, and I've pondered the question over the years whether I was a survivor or not. And for a long time, I thought I wasn't. And it wasn't until I started doing work with my mom, who's a mental health worker in the Bronx, who provide services for our community in Cambodian and in Vietnamese for so long, that I realized that, I'm also a survivor of the genocide and the war in Southeast Asia. And here I am thinking I'm only a Bronx girl, everything is Bronx. And so when we build Mekong, I think for us, and thinking about what it means to be in this country, to not only honor the civil rights movement, but the folks that really allowed us to be in this country, who fought. Bayard Rustin, for example, went to Cambodia, to the refugee camps to interview people, to make sure that our voice was part of the civil rights movement and that we were able to live and be free in this country. And free in this country means many things. And so when we started Mekong, I knew that we have to be rooted in social justice, but at the same time that we really wanted to build a movement that honored the history of the Bronx and how this country came to be, built on slavery and genocide, right? And so as refugee, always the question, once a refugee, always a refugee too, that statement is true to us. And so, to Mohammed's point, just how do we build intergenerational power? How do we create community as an act of resistance, right? And that when people ask me what is justice, I always say justice is healing, and that healing is a lifelong process. So even I think about campaigns that we wage against institutions and hospitals, for example, that's how we sort of started, was about the way in which for an entire community, our arts and culture worker were completely destroyed. So to build intergenerational power in this country meant we wanted to build a social justice movement grounded in its history, but also in the history of my people, and the culture of my people that were completely destroyed, and a responsibility for people, my generation, to see that carrying on the arts, and we've lost arts and art worker. And we, in Cambodia, there's a saying that art is the soul and culture is the soul of our people. So what happens when it's destroyed, right? And so now we're sitting with that question as people who've been here, for 20, 30 years now. I've been 40 years now. I'm aging myself a little bit. But, when I went back to Cambodia, it was actually to get our people who were deported, people who came like myself. So in some sense, building Mekong and what Mekong does honors the lands and history of all the people that we've been to, we've landed on, we've settled in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, you're talking about community and this idea of reimagining what it would mean to have a future. And I wanted to touch with Anna about art helping us reimagining the role of community in healing addiction, or even reimagining what addiction, sickness, healing looks like. If you can talk a bit about your projects at your EDF.
Yeah, I would be happy to. Sure. And thank you for having me. I feel privileged to be on stage with the three of you. So yeah, reimagining community, and I do it through theater. And I mean, today I have been moved to tears so many times and have been moved to think about who am I in the people that I see on stage, and what am I connecting to, and what is moving me, and why is it moving me? And really, and that's the work that I do in the world, is taking stories from community, putting them into narratives, into people on stage that kind of reflect back to communities what is happening, and what is happening down to the nuance of relationship and feelings and the way we talk to each other. So the way that I help people reimagine the way our community could look is that I give you a play. I give you a play that looks, that gives you characters that are probably some like that people that are in your life. And maybe you identify with somebody on stage. Maybe somebody on stage is like your mother or your father or a loved one. And I walk you through a story about addiction. And I walk you through all of the emotions and how addiction affects the individual and the family. And then at the end, I don't give you a resolution on purpose. One, because recovery from addictions, recovery from mental health disorders is an ever-evolving process, right? But also because I want to have our audience members really think about, okay, so what next? What can we do next, right? And so our audience engages with us in a talk back about what our community could do better, and what individuals could do better about addressing addiction and supporting loved ones. So that's one way that I help communities reimagine, and all of our actors are folks that are in recovery themselves or have some personal lived experience. And so we have this piece between us and the audience off stage, but also there's a reimagining and a community that we're building on stage with the actors, where they're stepping into roles that are like them, but maybe not exactly like them, and they're going back and they're reflecting on how they were impacted by substance use or by a family member's substance use, and in relationship with each other, helping to kind of heal together and build a community of recovery. And also, in doing that, we're showing communities outside of us what a community of recovery could look like. So yeah, I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The three of you are coming from, I would say, three different points of view, you know what I mean? Three different, I wouldn't say points of view, entry points into this notion of dealing with trauma in some way, or using the art as a healing tool. And we've talked a lot of things today throughout this day, but I feel like there are two questions that are emerging, that are percolating above the conversations we've had today. This notion of the cultural relevance of the art that you would work with, you know what I mean? Particularly as we think about whether we want to standardize or have things be widespread, how important is that? I actually spoke to a researcher today by the name of Britton, who, I don't know if she's around, but she sort of tickled my thoughts and it came up again. And something that Chris said early this morning about the role of the community itself within the creation of the healing endeavor. I don't know if I can probably open that up. I wanted to maybe go back to Mohamed about this notion of the role of culture, cultural resonance, whose art for whom, who is seeing it, or even thinking of your own work, Mohamed, and the lens of when someone is bringing a particular lens when they look at this, you know what I mean? And it's very many layered. So I don't know if you wanted to comment a bit about that, the terms of the cultural dimension of the type of art used for particular communities, and what's the role of culture, relevance, history, and these things in terms of the choice of interaction, yeah.
Sure. I mean, I can speak to my own personal experience. As a Syrian, Muslim, Arab, Syrian immigrant, brother to a refugee,
Yeah.
Syrian American citizen now, you cannot help but to have this guilt feeling, and perhaps it's some survival guilt feeling, because I looked at my brother-in-law's life and my sister, who across the Mediterranean on a little dinky float across the Mediterranean at night with all that. And I realized I could have been in that seat. None of us have chosen, our path. A lot of us are just a result of destiny. So with that comes a survivor guilt feeling that led me to think that a lot of us, especially the minority artists that are in the West and are able to reach a wider audience, not only are we encouraged to do so, but also it's our responsibility to build these cultural bridges between our people, our stories, and other cultures in the West, in particular in times of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and the divisions. And then the other audience you're speaking to is your own, who have been born and raised perhaps in refugee camps, not knowing anything about their roots. The Syrian conflict has been going on for 11 years now. What do you tell that generation that has not known how rich the roots are? So I found myself painting two images, an image of the aftermath of the refugee crisis to help educate and humanize the trauma that a lot of the refugees have been through. But also I find myself building a lot of nostalgic pieces like the ones on the screen right now that shows our generations that how our culture have existed. And a lot of these pieces are multimedia, where I incorporate sounds that I've recorded in my last visit 12 years ago to Syria, of how the streetscapes in itself in the Middle East sounded like, with the happiness and the joy and the car horns and all of that. I think for me, once I've realized my place as an artist and the responsibility I had on my shoulder, that guilt feeling kind of eased away. And it really brought me to peace. It centered me, because for a long time, before I've taken this art to the public, I was extremely troubled that why did I, get saved? What am I going to do about it? I can't continue my life just saying, okay, well, I have a beautiful life in America. All of that is in the Middle East. It didn't affect me. What am I going to do with it? So when I decided to share my art, I literally had 12 years worth of body of work that was built in secret that was published all of a sudden.
Fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. I know. What about yourself, Chaya? Particularly the role of the community itself in building.
Yeah. We're constantly living in, one of the things that we believe in is intergenerational power, building that intergenerational power through organizing. And actually for us, like, organizing is an art form. It is a act of resistance. It is the way in which I think earlier someone mentioned that, we need a revolution in art. We need a revolution in this country, to really address, racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and everything, and imperialism. I'm here because, the U.S. was over there. And so part of the healing in the art is like the truth finding and all of that. And also the building of, for us, it's really like the building of culture, because we've lost so much and so many people. And so it is exciting to see folks imagine what it feels like to be liberated, to be free through the arts, but also through building community gardens, music, through our programs and projects that engage in intergenerational conversation. I know oftentimes, like, people in our communities, like, there's an intergenerational gap, there's a gap. I'm like, actually, we've just never sat down and had these conversations with each other. And so the organizing work that we do is the healing work, is the art work, is the liberatory work. And we do need to address these man-made suffering that our people, the bombs, the isms, all the isms that we can think of, the sexism. So when I think about my work and like our movement, the Southeast Asian folks, I think about it at the intersection of healing and organizing. And I also think about what it means to bring other intersections of our life. How does class, gender, race, who's actually getting the money to run these programs, who are actually healers in our community. And so it is finding these truths and allowing people to really um, um, define art in their fight for justice.
Thank you. I do want to ask some policy questions, but I'm going to ask the evidence question. I'm going to ask Anna. Because we talked a lot about evidence before, our wonderful presentations about research, because I come from a policy background myself, and a big part of the, you know, the first definition of policy they tell you is an authoritative decision that brings benefits to some and sanctions to others. That's the other part that we haven't talked about here. But if you look at policy in that way, everything has a benefit and a sanction at the same time. So I wanted to talk a bit about evidence. What does evidence look like for your programs, Anna?
Well, I could go on and on with anecdotes, but I'll give you actual evidence.
Yeah.
So I've had the pleasure of working with Dr. Nisha Sajnani for the last few years on a mixed method study, looking at two of the plays that I wrote. And I wrote one in response to some of the evidence or some of the impact that we saw the first one make. So the first one is about a family. It's very much about a white middle-class family and their struggle with the opioid epidemic. And the second one is a deeper dive into different addictions and also the intersections of socioeconomic status, the experience of veterans, the experiences of Black and brown people in the drug war in this in our communities. And so there has been, we call it arts-based research, these iterations that keep happening because of the evidence that we're collecting. And so some of the things that we found is that, one, after people watch one of my performances, they are more likely to be compassionate towards somebody that's struggling with a substance use disorder. We have found particularly that white audience members are more likely to, so most people are more likely to agree that addiction is a disease after watching one of my plays. But specifically, white audiences are more likely to agree that addiction is a disease when the character who's struggling with addiction is played by a white person than a Black person, which was a really interesting finding, which is why I really wanted to bring more characters of color into the second performance. We also have found that after performances, people are more likely to take social action. And that could be something as small as talking to a friend or a family member that they think may be struggling. We also have naloxone or Narcan, which is the antidote to an opioid overdose, available after performances in the lobbies of the theaters. And what we've seen is that when people are coming into the theater, they'll look at the table. We'll encourage them to go get trained, but we'll have one or two people go over. But at the end of the performance, I always walk out into the lobby and there's a line of people waiting to get trained in naloxone or Narcan. So people are more likely to take social action. And following performances, we always give people resources, right? We're giving them Narcan, we're connecting them with local resources. So not only are they more willing to, but they also have more confidence in doing it because they actually have the resources. And one last anecdote, I don't know that I can call this evidence, but so I recently have become a senior advisor to the governor of Rhode Island, which has been such a pleasure to really help talk with him about addiction and recovery, and particularly the rise in the need for and the efficacy of harm reduction services. And recently, we passed the first bill ever in the United States of America in Rhode Island to open a pilot project where they would be able to open up harm reduction centers or safe injection sites, places that people can go use drugs and be watched and by medical personnel to make sure that they're safe and given clean needles and all of those things. And so we're in this big room. The governor is going to sign the bill, and before he goes to sign the bill, he says, I want to tell you about why I'm signing this bill. And he started by saying, well, a few years ago, I watched this play called Four Legs to Stand On about a family in which the son was struggling with an opioid use disorder. And then I listened to a community of my constituents talk about how they had been impacted by opioid use disorder. And he said that, among other things, is the reason why I'm signing this bill. So I don't know that I can call that evidence, but I'm gonna keep using that as a piece of evidence that is helping drive social change. So all those things are driving social change, but I'd like to think that I'm also helping shift policy and push policy forward.
That's fantastic. I mean, I call it's evidence. It's qualitative evidence, as my professor would say, and it's outcome and impact. And it's also a great segue into, the policy question, because a big part of today is this notion of who's listening and try to influence. And we are in this conversation at the site, the personal site. In many ways, Mohamed, your work is personal, but it's also very global, because there's so many people looking. And, not to put you on the spot, but the great responsibility you feel for an entire people, you know what I mean? It's really quite something, as well as yourself, Mekong, and with Mekong and Anna for your program. And I wanted to ask the sort of a policy application question. So the major goal of the symposium is to motivate people who can create and implement local and national and global policy on art and health interventions, right? So I wanted to ask sort of like the one question, Now, the WHO defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. If you could contribute, right, to policy or something around the world, what would you say to those with power to create and implement policy? This could be advice, a suggestion, a warning, or a request. What would you say?
Demand.
Or a demand. So you have the floor. This is quite, we have a big, this is a platform. So, I put the soapbox and I shine off the top, so there it is. Who wants to go first? So is that the hard question?
I can go.
Yeah.
I can go first.
Yeah.
And then
Thank you.
Mohamed can go as well. I mean, it's when you say that, I think about the campaigns that we wage, the organizing that we do, the fight for justice that we do within Mekong, and how we've built a movement that is grounded in, not just being anti-Black, but pro-Black, the rights of indigenous people to their lands, working with our men to end patriarchy, working with our young people to build power, transforming our own self as leaders, because, I think about as we survive these systems and survive others, who's surviving us? And so I think about that as I raise my 3 children, who are radical leftist, anti-patriarchal people, non-binary, and they're so free. And I'm like, I wish all of us was free like you all. And so, so that's my greatest pride. And I think about who is most impacted by these policies. It's really people of color, women, queer folks, gender non-conforming folks, people who are at the margin. And so those are the people that should be determining and making these policies. And sometimes even when, the fight for justice is really the fight for our dignity, right, as people. And so when I think about what it means to demand for justice, is to demand for us to even be in community sometimes and build community. And stop stealing from us, and that's oftentimes you can't love our culture but not love our people. We can't have that. And I think that for me, the demand is for us to be more conscious of these social injustices, and to really believe in Black leadership, in women and queer folks and gender non-conforming people. And oftentimes it is. It's believe in us and trust in us. Because we don't want to be resilient anymore. We just want to live in joy and love and all that stuff. And so that's what I think about when I think about policy and who should be making the decision. It should be us.
Thank you. Thank you. Who wants to go next? Mohamed.
Mohamed, do you want me to go, or are you going to go?
You go. I'll
Okay. So the question is, what is my ask of...
What's your ask? What's your contribution?
what's my, oh gosh.
And there's ... after that.
Dot, yeah,
But
yeah,
that's just a question. So
Yeah.
that's my framing, but you're making a contribution, a warning. People are making policy, they want to put this stuff together. They're looking at the research and they're at the table and they're writing herewith unto thee for,
Yeah.
what's coming after that?
Yeah, I mean, that the policies should come from the people for sure, and not only, that healing and justice and movement forward happens in community. And it has to happen in community. And we can't just Band-Aid things, or we can't just attend to one thing over here, but we really need to look at how this one thing affects everything around it. And so we can't just like throw a money or funding or something specific over here, that we have to address it all at the same time. And that what the needs are do have to come from the people that are suffering, that have to come from the communities.
Coming from the community, holistic policy.
Yep.
Now we have about 2 more minutes to be on the, anything else? If you
Save the world in 2 minutes, Mohamed.
So I will tell you briefly. That all sounds great, but one of the things that I've learned by being a corporate architect, when I was clean shaven in my suits, flying all over, building buildings $300 million, and so you can imagine the clientele are predominantly white in the market that I was working, and predominantly conservative right wing. That experience really gave me, I clicked because I was, they thought I was Italian. And I blended in. And before I knew it, I realized there were so much similarities between my own culture and where I worked and where I designed the building in Houston, in the Southern culture. And oftentimes, talk about policy, it's oftentimes, these stereotypes, you would think like, these are the regions that are going to be more spicy against Syrians, Muslim against them. So what? What I realize is artists, sometimes the people are, we're just way too loud, that, and rightfully so, I'm not saying, rightfully so, we're too loud in our criticism and our activism, that we undoubtedly cannot reach a big swath of the society that is changing policymakers. How do you reach the normal Joe that is supporting a certain politician that is saying, let me make a travel ban that bans Muslims? What I found, and this is my message for politicians, don't support art because it's an activist check mark that you want to do and you want to look good in front of audience. There are artists out there that have really figured out to reach as far right and as far left in the artwork, and have believed in the power of art, how it can transgress and demolish any boundaries and walls, and can reach every heart that out there. For me, I've shown in the United Nations, I've shown all of that. That was great. But the most evidence that I've ever had was in my own university, Iowa State, when I had the exhibit of the refugee bags that you saw, where a bunch of girls came in with "Women for Trump" T-shirts, and the body language was such a very kind of rough. And then at the end of the show, when they experienced all of these stories, heard the refugees by themselves telling their stories, they came to me and they didn't say a single word, but one of them just did this with tears in her eyes and said, "Thank you," and walked away. And so I realized that art really can change so many minds. And if our politicians are thinking still that supporting artists is just another progressive check mark to do, they're really not utilizing this tool fully. It's a tool that reaches the East and the West and demolishes any boundaries between any humans.
Thank you. I'm sure we're out of time. Thank you so much, Mohamed. Thank you, Chaya. Thank you, Anna. And thank you to all of you for listening. And I think that's the best final word, this idea of art meeting beyond boundaries to the east and the west and the north and the south. Thank you so much.